We are live.
Okay. Morning. This is Tuesday, February 14th. Our order of business is S6. Intend to go through a redraft of the bill that has been prepared by our legislative counsel. Then, please, I believe this is draft 3.0.
Yes.
For those who are following.
Yes, so Ben Novogrovsky from the Office of Legislative Counsel. Before the committee today is draft 3.0 of an amendment to S6. As a general overview, this draft amendment does a few things. It incorporates a lot of the discussions about the juvenile interrogation policy itself that the committee has discussed, but it also, this most recent draft really incorporates the definition of law enforcement officer that was the subject of debate, and then also really breaks down the model interrogation policy to be adopted by the council and then by law enforcement agencies and constables acting pursuant to law enforcement authority. So I'll go into the details of it. In section 1, the definition of deception now includes knowing preceding each clause. So it now includes the knowing communication of false facts about evidence, knowing misrepresentation of the accuracy of the facts, the knowing misrepresentation of the law, and the knowing communication of unauthorized statements regarding leniency. This is to address the concerns that were raised by some stakeholders about whether or not that knowing mental state was pervasive throughout the definition. This assures that it is. On page 2, starting on lines 5 through lines 10, this is now includes two definitions, new definitions, law enforcement officer and government agent. These will be included in the juvenile interrogation statute. So law enforcement officer has the same meaning as in 20 VSA section 2351A, which includes state police, municipal officers, the Capitol Police, investigators from various departments, game wardens, I believe the Provost General of Vermont National Guard, anybody that could be construed as practicing and certified as law enforcement is now captured in that definition. Government agent, after discussions with stakeholders and through the committee, I believe my connection is, so now it includes a school resource or safety officer or someone acting at their direction. So this would presumably cover, it's really a belt and suspenders type approach because there is some uncertainty over whether or not school safety or resource officers were actually certified. So this not only would capture those that are certified by the law enforcement officer definition, but also those that may not be certified, and then those that would be acting at their direction. So for instance, if a school resource officer told a school administrator to act on their behalf, it would presumably cover that situation. Let me see if I can reconnect now. Okay, there we go. So that is covered in subdivision 5A and B. So next, nothing really remains unchanged for the next couple of pages. Section 2 is just the redesignation of the electronic recording statute.
I had a question about part of this in section 2, in subsection B. A person's refusal to be electronically recorded. I was wondering if you could you have an idea of where that originated, if we talked about that, because I do have some concerns if somebody is in police custody at a barracks or police department, they're being interrogated and they say they don't want to be recorded. I just kind of have some concerns about somebody being in custody and they're and then, a recording just not existing when they're in custody. So,
Yeah, I can't speak to how that originated. I mean, this is a part of the bill that really only exists because it's being redesignated, but this, I can't speak to the origin of that language. I think it's just to account for that exact situation. Just someone doesn't want to be recorded,
Yeah.
then that request needs to be honored.
Yeah, I know, if you're entering somebody's house, you have to, inform them that they're being recorded, and if they don't want to be recorded, you have to shut it off, but, something for discussion, it could be that subsection there. I just think any recording, or any interviews or interrogations while the person is detained should be recorded unless it falls into the other categories.
Right, and I think your reference to being detained probably covers it, but these are for custodial recordings only. So it doesn't cover all types of questioning that a law enforcement officer may do. It's only ones that qualify for custodial interrogation.
Thanks.
Okay.
So moving on. So now in section 3, which is the juvenile interrogation statute that was really the topic of most of the discussion, and now reads that a person under 22 years of age, and you'll see on lines 13 and 14 on page 5, that it now includes a law enforcement officer or government agent shall not employ threats, physical harm, or deception. And that language is throughout, so 22 years of age is in subsection B, and also the reference to law enforcement officers or government agents in subdivision 2B as well. So those are the main changes there. Now, the big changes between the last version and this are regard the adoption of the model interrogation policy. So after reviewing the legislative history of the fair and impartial policing policy, I attempted to mirror the timelines of the most recent update to that, which was in 2017, and also the form in which it came to be. So section 4 is session law. So it's not going to be codified in the green books. It has the same force and effect of law, but this is the concerns, the mandate for the Criminal Justice Council to create the policy. So it gives until October 1st of this year, the council in consultation with the AG's office to collaborate and create a model interrogation policy that applies to all persons subject to various forms of interrogation. And that list is the same as before. So custodial interrogations occurring in a place of detention, outside of place of detention, ones that are not considered custodial regardless of location, and then interrogations of people with developmental, intellectual, psychiatric disabilities, substance use disorder, and low literacy rates. Then in subsection B, on or before January 1st of 2024, the council in consultation with stakeholders, and this language mirrors some of the people who were involved in fair and impartial policing policy adoption. So it involved the League of Cities and Towns, the Vermont Human Rights Commission, and then the Innocence Project, given their role in this legislation, would cooperate to update the policy to establish one cohesive policy for law enforcement agencies and constables to adopt, follow, and enforce of their, as a part of their own model interrogation policy, which that language might get a little confusing. So it would just be their own interrogation policy to say that there really aren't competing models, so to speak. So that's some language that might need to be cleaned up on my part. Section 5 concerns the grant eligibility that's been discussed. Again, this would go into effect on April 1st, 2024, that law enforcement agencies would be prohibited from receiving grants or other financial assistance. They're not in compliance with the model interrogation policy. Section 6 is the statewide policy itself, defining custodial interrogation, place of detention. Subsection B codifies that session law language, that the model policy should include those certain enumerated situations. And then subsection C is really the operative policy that gives April 1st as the deadline for law enforcement agencies and constables exercising law enforcement authority to adopt, follow, and enforce the interrogation policy that was adopted by the Criminal Justice Council, and it would include each component of the model policy established by the council, and then those officers and constables should comply with the policy. Then on or before October 1st, 2024, and every other year after that, the council, in consultation with the AG, the Human Rights Commission, shall review and update the policy if necessary. Subsection D discusses basically the need for continued review and the adoption of the policy. So it reads that, again, in consultation with the AG, the council reviews the policies of the agencies and constables to ensure that they establish each component, and that needs to be done by April 15th, 2024. So that's essentially just over 2 weeks after the policy needs to be adopted. And then it's sort of the back end check by the council to make sure that it actually was. If it finds that the policy was not adopted, it can work with the law enforcement agency or constable, and if all else fails, the model policy that the Criminal Justice Council creates will be the default policy of that agency or constable. Subsection E requires that the council incorporate provisions of this training or of these policies into the training it provides. Subsection F goes into sort of the annual certification that the Criminal Justice Council or that the law enforcement agencies need to report the adoption of the policy annually, and then basically the council determines if the officers have received training along the lines of the policy. And then subsection G is the council's report to this committee and the House Judiciary Committee, essentially certifying which law enforcement agencies and officers have received training on interrogation methods. Section 7 of the bill is the appropriation to the Vermont Criminal Justice Council to create that director of policy position. So the $150,000 that was previously discussed. And then section 8 is the effective date. So everything except for the grant eligibility and the operative section of the adoption of the policy goes into effect on July 1st. Those sections will go into effect on April 1st, 2024. And then finally, the title of the bill is now changed to an act relating to law enforcement interrogation policies.
Okay.
So I just have a question. So my understanding is that the stakeholder group is to include those, but could include others. My concern is that we're carving out a specific population, developmental and intellectual disabilities, psychiatric disabilities, substance use disorder, and low literacy levels, and we don't have a stakeholder named that would really be able to speak on behalf, with education on behalf of those individuals. And I don't know if that's the Agency of Human Services, the Department of Mental Health, the Vermont Center for Independent Living, but it feels like we should name a stakeholder explicitly to speak to that group we carved out.
Agency of Human Services decide who in the Secretary's office to.
So AHS.
Just check if anybody who's either in the room or online zooming in wants to comment on that. I don't see any hands because I can't see.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
I have a separate question
Oh,
on
okay.
what you're doing with this one here.
I don't see any hands, so I guess that's okay. Senator Norris.
Yeah, I just have two quick questions, and obviously I don't know the answer to this, and that's why I'm asking them, Ben. In reference to this law that we're sitting here discussing, so forth, is there any types of penalties and or fines or just loss of the interrogation? And then it's maybe something that the council would take up after the fact as far as inappropriate conduct by a law enforcement officer during interrogation, or I don't see anything.
Well, nothing in this. There, you know, the Vermont Criminal Justice Council has its unprofessional conduct standards. And I believe category B misconduct includes either a substantial or gross deviation from policies adopted. So that, depending on the situation, could cover a deviation from the interrogation policy. But there's nothing in this statute. The only real teeth to this is on the agency level, that if they don't adopt and follow it, grants, there'd be grant ineligibility, and also they wouldn't be able to receive training from the council, which is already part of, it's already in statute if they don't follow certain policies and standards.
Okay. And part two of my question is, when this started out, it was juvenile interrogation, so on and so forth. It obviously has expanded to include all interrogations. Is there any conflict or run over when it comes to the Supreme Court decision of Frazier versus Cup on this particular issue that we're talking about? Or
I don't believe that there's a conflict. I think it expands upon that sort of a baseline.
I think deceptive, correct me if I'm wrong. The two things the bill now does is, one, deceptive practices are banned for those under 22. The second thing the bill does now is creates a model policy for all law enforcement agencies that they will have to follow, and it's up to the Criminal Justice Training Council to develop that policy. If the policy is no deception, then that would be the policy, but if the policy is XXX, then it'd be whatever the Criminal Justice Training Council comes up with. I think it's a way to perhaps have more, we heard testimony that certain police agencies were still using the land. We heard testimony the state police that said that wasn't good. So this would just be a more minimum standard. They could be, a police agency could go on beyond that minimum standard, if I'm not incorrect. And say, we're not gonna use this, this, and this. Anyway, but a minimum standard be developed by the council.
Did that?
yeah,
I have a related question, and that is, so as Senator Sears just laid out, it's doing two things, one for the under 22 or 22 and under, and one for everybody. I'm wondering, am I missing it, or does it say somewhere in the model policy that it should, I'll use the term, educate officers on the juvenile piece? In other words, I don't see the juvenile prohibition on deception and those practices mentioned, and it seems like it should.
Well, there is no explicit mention of it, but the way I envision the law sort of operating just in reality, but again, they could be more explicit, is that, the juvenile protections will be codified into law. That's something that would be the law of the land that presumably the academy and any training would have to abide by. But that being said, there's nothing in this model policy that we're talking about that mandates juvenile training explicitly. It just says whatever the model policy would have to be trained on. Presumably that model policy would have to abide by.
And I'm not thinking that the model policy would be the tool, because we've already done that in statute theoretically if it passes. I'm just thinking it's an opportunity to educate people. If we're going to develop a model policy on interrogation, it seems worth pointing out that there's this new law saying you can't use these practices for under 22.
Yeah, that could be explicitly written into, I'd imagine, section 6.
It's a matter of opinion whether we need it, but I just happen to think of that.
Yeah, and I don't think it would be explicitly necessary to do it given the statute,
Yeah.
Which would presumably incorporate that into the training. But again, it's not necessarily a bad idea to make it explicit so that, when someone were to read the statute and what the
And if they want to know
policy needs
what's
to
allowable in interrogation, this model policy as laid out here might not mention that, and then it's in two places.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that could be added to make it more consistent.
And I don't know what our timeline is on, if the intention is to vote this out today.
Well, I was hoping to vote it out today simply because it's gonna go to appropriations. The addition, yes.
Julio Thompson, Attorney General's Office, Civil Rights Unit. Just to follow up on the development of the policy, because I see there's language here that proposes that our office be involved in the development. I mean, just speaking for our office, it's from our office's perspective, it's inconceivable that we would develop a state model policy that doesn't include provisions regarding juveniles to ensure that everyone complies with the law. And I think that it's likely, and again, the process hasn't started. If it's enacted, there's some off. But I think there are other dimensions of juvenile interviews and interrogation that will necessarily be part of the policy. And that includes, for example, access to adults or guardians and the like. Time and place of the interview where it might conflict with school, dealing with the school environment and so forth, school specific environment. So I had previously provided the committee examples of interrogation policies from other jurisdictions. And I mentioned that I had worked in connection with the Baltimore consent decree on their interrogation policies. They have one policy that is the global policy and then a separate policy that's specific to juveniles. And New Orleans has a 2018 policy that does the same thing. There are special provisions for vulnerable subjects of interviews, and that includes, but it's not limited to juveniles. So from our perspective, that's a necessary component of the policy, whether it's added to the statute or not. I can't see how you couldn't include compliance with a state law. So that's our perspective on it.
And to be clear, Mr. Chair, I would be fine with voting this out today, and if there was an appetite to add that piece in appropriations,
Yeah.
then we could do that.
Any comments from anybody? Any questions? Field? Senator?
I do have one more question. I told somebody that I would bring it back up because they asked, and just revisiting a previous question with some more additional nuance regarding online investigations of lewd and lascivious conduct, and predators trying to get in contact with juveniles. One of the questions is, if law enforcement is developing a case, they have evidence of an adult talking to somebody that they believe to be a juvenile, and they end up getting arrested and they're detained, they're being interviewed, and the police or the detective presents this evidence where the defendant believed and continues to believe that they were talking to a juvenile. Is that a deceptive tactic in that interrogation or interview?
Well, we'd have to be a knowing misrepresentation of facts. It presumably could be captured by that. But it's dependent on each case, but I'm not going to say that there's no conceivable situation where it wouldn't be swept under this law.
Thank you.
Whether, it'll take a while before the bill hits the floor, so if there's are people comfortable with the appropriation? It's something we didn't plan on, but the testimony certainly that.
We remind us the appropriation again?
It's $150,000 for the policy director at the criminal justice training.
Yeah.
I'm perfectly fine with it. I do know that 150 was a placeholder number and they were supposed to get back to us with a more specific number. Did they ever do that?
I followed up with Deputy Director Brickell, and he said that was the right number.
Perfect. Then I'm good with it.
And I do think it's, our responsibility every once in a while, because we dish work to them quite often to follow up with resources.
Keep giving them jobs to do. We have to
I know.
fund them. Anyone else who would like to comment before we move any further on this? Right. Thank you, Ben, for the good work.
Sure, and I'll add AHS to one of those collaborators and training council.
We could presumably set up before, we could do the vote. Obviously, if there's anything that in the when you do the 3.1. We would be voting on it, on version 3.1. I know.
Once it goes through editing, it would be 4.0 at that point.
I never understand your.
It is confusing. Basically, anytime that I change something, it'll be like 0.1, 0.2, but anytime that the editors touch it, it gets the whole new number. So it's just that.
See, I always assumed it had to do with the magnitude of the change, but no.
I know some bills we got up to 11.
Yeah.
Okay, is there a motion to report? Yes, Senator Baruch has moved that we report S3 favorably,
Second.
seconded by Senator Hashim. Any further discussion? Senator,
Just quickly clarify exactly what we're voting on here.
we're voting on the
changes to our-
3.0 with the minor changes that have been discussed.
Yeah, so there would be a change, like, probably the most substantive change is adding AHS as one of the stakeholders to collaborate in the creation of the model policy. And then there are some grammatical and terminology, just errors that need to be cleaned up to be consistent.
Well,
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to say that I really appreciate how deep we've dove into this as a committee and how much we've worked on it. And I do still have pretty significant concern with the idea that law enforcement can lie to anyone, especially at a time when we really need to be rebuilding trust in community and building community safety. And if we are going to take an incremental approach, it seems to me that we should be informed by the science and data, which pretty clearly shows that this impacts those 25 and under the most. That said, I will be voting yes, because what's before us is certainly an improvement on where we are right now. And it is the best, in my understanding, policy of this nature in the country, but we are still decades behind international policy. So I think that we've got pretty significant need to move this forward and continue to improve.
it is S6, not S3.
Yeah.
I mistakenly said S3.
I just wanted to
That's a
add
different bill.
for Senator Norris, it is, sometimes you want to actually see the changes. And so we wait and then brings back a draft if there's something where the wording really is going to need one more wordsmithing. I'm fine with voting on this as it is, but it's every senator's right if they really want to see the changes, even if they're minor, before they vote. So it's an open question whether people feel comfortable voting with a verbal description of those small changes.
Actually, now that Ben's clarified this, and I know there's a need to push this out of appropriations, I'm fine with voting on it today. Just once again reviewing once those changes do come through.
Thank you. Peggy, would you please call the roll?
Senator Baruch,
Yes.
Senator Norris,
Yes.
Senator Bihovsky,
Yes.
Senator Hashim,
Yes.
Senator Sears.
Yes. Who would like to report this?
I'm hoping to report another bill, so.
Yeah. You? Yeah. I think it'd be good, actually, first bill and back to your formal enforcement.
Would I be reporting this after it goes through its
Yeah.
appropriation?
Yeah.
So then probably the next week.
Well, I don't even know.
And we,
Depends on us talking to Jane and saying, can you throw this in someday?
so it might be a little fluid because I'll be talking about this later today, but I have to be away a couple of days for my daughter's wedding next
So
week.
congratulations.
So probably we'll be either bringing stuff, clearing the calendar before and then waiting until after I get back to move things through.
Sounds good.
Well, I would say probably 2 weeks.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
I was just curious.
You know. Thank you.
And you'll get it to me once it goes to editing.
Yep.
And then I'll give it to you, Senator Hashim.
Okay. All right, now let's have some more fun. Go to S14. We just couldn't help ourselves. Make changes to that one too. I think they're positive changes. I don't want to be mistaken here because I've seen too many YouTube videos of senators laughing at something.
Well, I would.
So I'm not laughing, I'm just, they're positive changes.
Give me one moment to.
Oh, we're not taking it.
This particular page may look familiar if you get that facial resemblance.
Oh, yeah.
Last name Chitnitz.
Oh.
I said that's okay, I'm not taking any more calls. Woman from Newark. All to encourage me to vote no, that's not.
That would be from Massachusetts.
I don't know where that Newark is. Maybe New Jersey. Anyhow. So, want to go through the draft 3.0 of this one?
Yeah, so draft 3.0 of S14. So there are quite a few changes, hopefully all positive, as Senator Sears said. But primarily, after talking with the Council of State Governments and referring to the FBI's definitions of clearance, so that this is sort of regards the first two changes here under the definition section of 3 VSA 3029A. So arrest is now defined as a person being seized by law enforcement, charged with the commission of offense, and referred for prosecution. Again, this is in line with the FBI's definition of arrest within clearance rates. And clearance means the process by which a law enforcement agency closes an offense by arrest or by exceptional means in accordance with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Uniform Crime Reporting Program. So that's why arrest is defined, is because it's referenced in the definition of clearance, and then exceptional means is defined in subdivision 4, which means the death of the offender, the victim's refusal to cooperate with the prosecution after the offender is identified, the denial of extradition because the offender committed a crime in another jurisdiction and is being prosecuted, or other circumstance in accordance with the Uniform Crime Reporting Program. It's because these don't capture every situation that could qualify as exceptional needs.
Can I make clear, we talk about clearance in this terminology. We're not talking about the clearance rate of court backlog.
Correct.
Which some have used as they call it clearance. I think some of the witnesses in the Barrett case, the Barrett confirmation, were referring to the backlog as clearance rates. We're talking about here about an arrest made. The reason this is important to me anyway is that what I heard from the Council of State Governments is that it's actually more crimes deterred by the likelihood of getting caught than the sentence.
Yes, and so to that point, that's what clearance rate means in this context, is essentially from a law enforcement perspective, not from a court perspective of someone being arrested and prosecuted for a crime. So it would be those reported crimes. And so these rates are now incorporated into the report itself. So now under subdivision 2, the report shall include data and outcome indicators showing not just recidivism rates or evidence of persistence, but now clearance rates as was previously defined. The evidence of persistence now includes various things. So that would be the violations of conditions related to probation, parole, and furlough. So this language that previously existed now seemed to be more logically included with what persistence really includes, and sort of that lifespan of an offender and someone progressing to maybe commit lower types of or less serious types of crimes with less frequency. So those could include conditions of release, probation, parole, furlough, including whether those violations are related to non-compliance with drug-related conditions, whether they're considered violent, and technical, civil, or criminal in nature with any applicable charge code. So the charge code would actually be the citation to the statute itself. And really, the reason why it's phrased this way is that it could show the differences in a few ways. One, whether there are differences between agencies, departments, and branches of government in what they consider a violent crime. And also differences between the charges themselves and whether or not they're violent. So it would presumably show this data and any differences between the state itself considering things one way or the other. It would also include former and current supervisees of DOC charged with new offenses. So again, committed versus or charged, and then there's also convicted of new offenses, and that would be in subdivision 3. Another change would now regards subdivision F, which is really the justice reinvestment initiatives. So now the language has changed really to show that the outcomes of individuals certified JR2 and related initiatives. So it changes where would be the effects of the funding on the outcomes that that funding is aimed to address. So now in subdivision 1, it includes any effects funding for domestic violence intervention programming in DOC has had on domestic violence crime rates. With 2, any effects funding for offender transitional housing capacity with DOC and other departments has had on housing rates for individuals released from incarceration. Any effects funding the DOC's offender management system has had on the department's data monitoring, collection, and sharing, incarcerated individual case planning, and other related objectives. Those were some of the objectives espoused by the department for its offender management system and its updates. It would include any effects for community-based mental health and substance use services for individuals under DOC supervision, and what effect that has had on mental health and substance use needs. Any effects funding for agencies, departments, municipalities, programs, and services employing restorative justice principles like CJCs, and the effect that they've had on diverting individuals from the criminal justice system. And then sort of a catch-all of any other effects. Subdivision 7 and 8 captures the concern that the chair expressed about tracking out-of-state bed funds. So after consulting with Stephanie Barrett in the Joint Fiscal Office, there are going to be 2 data points around this. One, what the average number of DOC out-of-state beds are that have been paid by the department, and the average cost per bed in fiscal year 2019 and every year after that. So that will give a baseline figure for out-of-state beds starting in 2019, and it will be able to see how that trend has gone up or down every year after that. And then this will also compare to subpoint 8, which is the average number of DOC in-state beds available for housing incarcerated individuals from 2019 on. So you'll be able to get the average rate for out-of-state beds, the average rate for in-state beds, see the differences, and be able to calculate that difference between the 2. And that in subdivision 8 here, it would also be broken down by any specially designated populations. This would presumably include general population, detainees, segregated population, and any other designation that the department may have. So any questions about the changes to the justice reinvestment reporting?
I think we're good.
Okay, so moving on to subsection D, which is the data elements and availability. Subdivision 1 change. So now the data sets required under the report need to be aggregated to show outcome indicators for individual offenders. So it will show individual rates, but it will protect any personally identifying information, and then also include data elements showing the disparities between race, gender, age, income, and substance use disorder if they're available. Subdivision 2 talks about any obstacles or impediments related to the availability and collectability of the data. So the intent behind that would be to basically assess if their data isn't out there to explain that fact in the report. And then subsection E is the data sharing, which basically reemphasizes that everybody that is a custodian of this data needs to share it with the author of the report, who is the Secretary of the Agency of Human Services, and then the confidentiality which says this information remains confidential unless it's published in the report, and just affirming that the original custodians of the information remain the custodians, and any public records requests need to be sent on to them to respond to them. And then this act takes effect on July 1st. That is not changed, and then the change of the title of the bill, which remains unchanged from the last version.
Any comments, questions? I know this was very technical, but, waded through it. Any comments from the audience? Anyone who's online? You could take that down, Daryl. Is it
Dano, yes.
Dano.
Isaac Dano, Policy Director for the Department of Corrections. One thing I was thinking about last night while reading the latest version of the legislation was just the evolution we've seen since the previous iteration of the report. It started out tracking the amount of funds from out-of-state savings into justice reinvestment initiatives, just tracking those line items. And now it has really grown into a crime and violence report writ large, which I think is a laudable goal. One thing I was thinking was just due to the extreme change in scope of the bill and the number of different entities that are named, it might make sense to insert some language possibly about forming a working group or perhaps representatives of those different entities meeting at some point over the course of the year, because as someone who wrote the last iteration of the report, I can imagine how December 15th might roll around and the automated message notification that you have 4 weeks to submit the report might create a scramble on behalf of all the different entities to coordinate, to try and think about who owns what data that might be best served by perhaps building in a structure of designees from each entity to come together a regular fashion, maybe 2 or 3 times.
what's the committee? Wouldn't they automatically do that?
Perhaps it could be a lot of emailing, which was what happened in the previous iteration. A lot of cross wires.
I guess we could add a working group.
I mean, I'm always hesitant to make another working group, board, commission, et cetera. And I do hear sort of the sense here in bringing people together. My question for Ben or maybe Senator Sears is, do we have to do it formally in the bill, or can they just do that?
It doesn't need to be formal, but that's a policy consideration too, for you to decide.
I agree. I think it's liable to happen anyway. And it's not to say it would hurt anything, but it would add a formal level that we get complaints about more than thanks for. So, when you include people, all the relevant people on this working group, it formalizes their responsibility and they have to put in maybe more effort. And I don't know that it's worth the trouble. I do think that we could something like that.
I mean, it is a critically important issue, so I mean, I'm not opposed, but it always gives me pause, given how many of those formalized workforces, task forces, commission reports we have.
I mean, I guess the only consideration then, if it was to be formalized as a working group, then there would probably be some decisions made about frequency of meetings, what constitutes a quorum, sort of those more formal aspects of a group like that.
Send that to Senator Lyons.
Okay.
So if the committee wants to do that, we can, but those would be considerations that would have to be worked out as well.
I think it would be fair to get the response from the people who might be affected by the working groups. Why don't we can always do a floor event.
Can.
I'd like to hear. Different groups. Or we can hold off on voting on this. We have some time, another week.
The only time we have right now is Friday from 10:30 to 11:15.
Certainly don't have any time Thursday. Will we be done off the floor on Thursday by 11:30, you think?
We're on the floor at 1.
No, 10:30.
Oh, because of the joint
Yeah,
assembly. I think there's 3 positions to be voted, so it's gonna take up to noon probably.
all right, so we can come back to this on Friday.
Yeah.
That's the pleasure. Yes, Senator.
I have a question that's not related to the working group or a suggestion. In section D, subsection 1, the data piece, where we are including the data element showing disparities based on race, gender, age, income, and substance use disorder, I would love to see that also include education level and literacy, if people are amenable to that.
So, yeah, I can add that, and then, so by Friday, do you want to formalize a working group for this, or?
Yeah, but I think that Dana would volunteer to contact people with the honest working group.
Yeah,
Let them know that he's giving them more work. No, seriously, if you just, if you and Ben can work together to draft up what it would look like, and then just email to those folks who would be on it so that they're aware. I don't like placing responsibilities on people without giving them a chance to say yes or no.
Well, can I ask, would it be better to canvass their opinion first before we draft? If we send them to draft, it's easier for them to say yes. But if we ask them whether we should draft, maybe they would give us a difference.
I'm open to whatever flexible, lightweight solution would be best.
Doing it that way.
Yeah, yeah, because the other question would be, so obviously, right now, we have this sort of being sourced through the Secretary of Human Services, for lack of a better term, of being the author of the report. The working group, the report structurally would be coming from the working group then, and however structure would be, that's what the, if we sort of envisioning if we go down this route.
Because I'm looking at all departments shall provide upon request Secretary of Human Services with any data the Secretary determines is relevant. So I'm imagining the way this works now as a series of informal requests via email that the Secretary or Deputy is sending out, and they're not necessarily meeting. So back to the idea of whether you want a working group. If we have a working group, I think they're going to feel obligated to meet, and do they need to, I guess would be my question. But I'm not going to be doing it, so it should be dependent on what they.
If I may, Chair, my fear is that that some of the data might not exist or might need to be pulled between departments or custom data analysis, that it might not be as simple as emailing between a few different agencies. And I would just like to try and, avoid any of that chaos, just I think due to the goals of the bill, and try to bring people together to avoid that if possible.
But the information that we receive, we want to be accurate, and so I think if it's a working group helps to make it more accurate, then we should do it. However, I think, this becomes one of the more important, even though it seems like a simple little bill, it becomes one of the more important things in the session, because without disinformation, accurate information. We are stuck making generalizations. And even some of the information we've received from the past, I'm not sure how accurate that information is in terms of racial disparities and other information that we've received. I know that the Justice Center had to dig unbelievably to get any information out of Vermont systems. They're so archaic in terms of data entries. And in so many cases, when it's asked about race, there's no information. It just says not known. And so you can extrapolate what you want out of that. But what does that give us?
Not much.
Understood how bad off before.
Mr. Chair, so are we at where Isaac and I will canvass the groups first?
Yeah.
And then dependent on their input, either make changes or not?
Yep.
Okay.
And we'll vote on it on Friday.
Okay.
Hold off on voting Friday. So next up is S3. S3 is the bill that Dan.
I think those are already banned.
Well, I wonder sometimes.
We're not banning of the training for insurrections.
Yeah, training for insurrections.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask, is it all right to break into the Davos?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, I think I should.
Because
If there's more
We should.
cookies,
Yep. I just got
so this is just like the
Where
morning
is it?
sugar committee. Yes.
Yeah, it turned into that. That's fine.
Yes.
Well,
Gary's
it's been
not
me.
here yet, so we're 5 minutes ahead of schedule.
Over 5 minutes. We could have taken a 5-minute break if I had known we were at.
Do we still have it?
Still have
Because Eric's not here yet.
Was he coming remotely or in person?
I'm sitting in person.